Hello, bonjour, and welcome to your new Alti Wine Exchange video. Welcome to this channel where we explore, we learn about, and we taste the wonderful world of wine. If you're not familiar with the Alti Wine Exchange, it is a wine investment and trading platform as well as a wine club. Make sure to check out the link in the video description to learn more. So after our tours of some of the best wine regions of France and Italy that we've just concluded, and before moving on to Spain, yes, we're looking at all of the best wine regions in the world right here and explaining them. I want to have a little stopover with you in a country that is dear to the Alti Wine Exchange and a country that you should definitely have in mind. A country that should have more recognition on the international wine scene. The wines of Portugal are overall absolutely fantastic, often of incredible value for money. Generally, they're quite deep and really quite complex as well. They just need to be understood better to be enjoyed more by those in the know. And hopefully you will be one of us after watching this video. Because yes, there is way more to Portuguese wine than just the ports, as you will see today. The dry wines of Portugal are incredibly varied and fascinating to explore. So let's have a quick overview of what you're missing out on if you don't know much about Portuguese wines quite yet. This is your essential guide to start understanding Portugal and its vinhos. Let's go. There is a lot in Portugal beyond its fortified port wines, but since this is an overview of Portugal, I need to have a word about the elephant in the room, the ports. I'll make an entire individual video dedicated to port wines to detail what they are all about, what they taste like, the different styles, how they're made, etc. I'll link to it right here when it's out and ready, and at the end of this video if you want to go deeper on the topic. But for now, let's say that ports are the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the wines of Portugal. They are famous, they are the ones everyone knows about and often enjoy the most. And that's because they have been made for centuries, they have been exported for centuries, and the level of craftsmanship and refinement that they've reached as a consequence of all this immense history is immense. They are the jewel in the crown of Portuguese wines, for sure. In short, port wines are made from grapes grown in arguably the most spectacular wine region in the world, if you ask me at least, that is called the Douro Valley. So that's a hilly and continental area flanking the Douro River. It is named after. Traditionally, the wines were made in this hilly inland area of the Douro Valley, where the grapes are grown and then brought down the river to the city of Oporto, where they were aged, mature, and then exported on ships to the UK. Of course, the British love their ports, but also the rest of Europe, the Netherlands and beyond, and other continents also. Port wines are sweet fortified wines, meaning that the grape juice is fermented a little, the fermentation is started, but then pure alcohol is added to the wines to bring the alcohol level overall to about 19–20%, which kills the yeasts and stops the fermentation, therefore retaining the natural sugars from the grape juice. Hence, ports being sweet wines, dessert wines, some may call them. They're blended red wines from local grape varieties such as the Touriga Nacional, Touriga Franca or Tinta Barroca, and they're made in a variety of different styles that I'll explain into detail in that dedicated video, the vintage ports, the LBVs, the Tawnies, the Rubies, etc. They are beautiful, incredibly age-worthy wines, very varied in price, also as well in quality, and absolutely fascinating to taste. You must learn more about port wines, definitely, if you don't know much about them, so make sure to stay tuned for the full video about them. But for now, I want to show you that there's a lot more to Portuguese wines than just ports. So despite being a relatively small country, Portugal has an incredibly varied climate and topography, and that's because it's nestled in a corner of the Iberic Peninsula that also includes Spain. To summarize, the country is stuck in between mountain ranges to the east that form the border with Spain and the Atlantic Ocean to the west. So it's somewhat of a relatively narrow strip of land with high hills and mountains on one side and a lot of heat coming from Spain as well, and a long coastal line with very cool climatic influences from the Atlantic Ocean that is particularly cold in that spot. So every valley and every plain has its own little climate, microclimate, and its own varied geological formations, and therefore its own specific terroir. In short, so you have an idea of how Portugal works, let's have a look at a map. The Douro Valley is to the northeast of the country, but you can see that it's just a very small part of Portugal, while virtually the whole rest of the country is also covered in vineyards. So just looking at this map, you can easily imagine that there is way more to Portuguese wine than just ports. Just look at the map, and the Douro Valley is just a small part of it. So a brief overview, and to give you an idea of how varied this all is, let's fly over Portugal and its wine regions. To the very north of Portugal is a wine region called Vinho Verde, which is a very green and really lush, rather rainy and relatively cool climate area that makes the famously crisp and refreshing Vinho Verde white wine style. Then the Douro Valley produces grapes for port wines, but since ports are less popular nowadays than they used to be, they now make also fantastic dry red wines using the same grapes that for ports, and those grapes happen to be also amazing for dry wine. So the Douro Reds have now a fantastic reputation worldwide. They are deep, they're fine, their tannins are really soft and dense as well, loads of fruity characters, but also some spices, really a heap of personality there. This is often what I find with Portuguese wines. They somewhat combine the heat and the power from some Spanish wines with the refinement, the finesse, the tannins, the density, the depth that I associate more with French wine. This is somewhat how I personally define Portuguese wines in general, the best of both French and Spanish wine worlds combined. And I must say that the result is often spectacular. This is true for Douro wines, but also the other wine regions of Portugal. So we're moving south, about 80 kilometers or 50 miles south of the Douro Valley. This is a rather famous wine region called the Dow. It's hilly here and with a granitic soil, just like in the Douro. So they use similar grape varieties, but Dow is not as high as the Douro, so it's wet and cold in winter and hot in summer, and they have great conditions for growing fine wines because of those relatively cool but also warm conditions. In the Dow, like most areas of Portugal, they have very old vineyards that they restore, which often brings great wines from very old vines, but especially since the 1990s, they've also heavily invested in modernizing their wine industry. This means, one, replanting vineyards with more qualitative grape varieties to increase the quality, but it also means building modern wineries and buying state-of-the-art winemaking equipment from France and Italy, and applying very modern winemaking techniques and know-how so as to make really modern, controlled and refined wines. That expresses the local grape and the terroir. That's what you get when you control winemaking really well. And that's true in the Dow, but also elsewhere in Portugal. Further south, what's called Central Portugal has two main wine regions, namely Tejo and Lisboa, around the capital city of Lisbon. Here we're not on that hilly terrain in valleys and granitic soils anymore, but rather on a warm and really sunny maritime climate. Plains on sedimentary soils with limestone and clay. So wines are generally a little simpler, often released as AGP wines, made in a modern fruity style, reds, but also rosés and some whites, but they're extremely pleasing, really well made, fruity and very affordable wines of great value. Although of course locally some individual producers also make higher end wines in Tejo and Lisboa. worth looking into. And finally, we go all the way south to southern Portugal, that also has two main wine regions called the Setúbal Peninsula and the Alentejo. The Setúbal Peninsula is located just south of Lisbon, so quite a trendy rural destination for the people of Lisbon. They have vineyards in plains, but also on hilly terrains by the coast, with a lot of limestone and cooling influences from this cold ocean. So wines here can be made extremely refined and complex, including from the DOC Palmela appellation that makes very reputable high-end red wines from the Castelao grape. So that's Palmela. DOC is a staple in Portuguese wine that you must have in mind. They also make ultra-famous fortified wine from the Moscatel grape called the Moscatel de Setúbal, of which we had the privilege of offering several century-old examples on the Alti Wine Exchange, including this 1919 vintage edition that I reviewed in this video right here. It tastes incredible. If you want to learn more, right here. The other southern region of Portugal is way inland and called the Alentejo. This is a vast region that expands from the coastal Setúbal Peninsula that we've just talked about all the way to the border with Spain. Alentejo has known a wine renaissance over the past 20-30 years or so, and has acquired now a really solid reputation for the quality of its wine. Since this is a large region, they have their own variety of climates and soils, some schist areas, some sandy soils, areas that are very hot and continentals, others that have more influences included from the Mediterranean, because yes, we're closer to Spain and the Mediterranean than from the ocean here. But generally, Alentejo is hotter and more continental than the rest of Portugal, so richer and warmer wines, generally blended from local grapes such as Aragonês, Trincadeira and Castelao, although more and more they use other grapes like Touriga Nacional from the Douro, or international grapes like Alicante Bouschet or Syrah, just enriching the blends from local grapes. So a whole fascinating universe is there in Alentejo too, even within the region itself. As a conclusion, this was our quick overview, as quick as possible, of Portugal and its wine scene. I hope I've demonstrated how varied it is. It's probably what you'd call a small country. It only ranks at around 11th in the top biggest wine producing nations in the world. But with this multitude of mountains and valleys and coastal areas, it's really a patchwork of varied wine wonders. And you would have noticed as we flew over it in this video that it's got all the great fancy names when it comes to terroir that you hear experts talking about and going back to all the time. The granite, the schist, the limestone, they're all there around Portugal. And I must emphasize that Portugal also has fantastic grapes. They're local, they're unique to Portugal for most of them, and truly they're extremely suited for producing fine wines. So much so that I'll dedicate an entire video to explaining Portuguese grapes further, because they're really something special in the world of wine. So really it's this diversity of terroirs, regions, climates and grapes that makes the richness of Portuguese wines and why it's so interesting. But it is probably also why Portuguese wine is so misunderstood in the international wine scene. It's not simple and it's hard to summarize. It's taken me 15-20 minutes to do so. You can't do any more concentrated than this. You can't really categorize it into one archetypical style, which makes it hard from a marketing standpoint. You can't really explain simply to the average consumer what it's all about. So the general public doesn't understand Portuguese wines really well. But if you dig into it and if you know about it, well, you know that it can be really good. Also, I haven't talked much here about white wines from Portugal because the country is not all that famous for them. The reds are probably the country's forte, especially when it comes to fine wines. But know that every Portuguese region makes also very good white wines as well. So don't overlook them. They're really good quality. They can be fruity, vibrant, crisp because they have this cooler influence from the ocean. There's plenty to explore as far as white wines are concerned as well. On these final notes, I'll leave it here for today. Make sure to stay tuned to the channel for our next videos explaining port wines in particular and explaining deeper the Portuguese grape varieties specifically. Thanks for watching, and I will see you soon in the wonderful world of wine. Cheers.